Oh, hi, Internet. I'm here to talk about the real Hollywood movie. It's The Disaster Artist, y'all!
Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba.
Welcome to Thumb Together. Let's talk about Disaster Artist together. Oh boy, there's a lot to talk about here. This is a movie about a movie. It's one of those movies, which I've always really looked fondly on movies about movies because they must be tricky to write, tricky to make, all that fun stuff. The story of Disaster Artist, if you have no idea what it's about, if you've been living under a rock since 2003, it's about a infamous bad movie, The Room. Not Room with Brie Larson, very different. The Room. The Room stars a man by the name of Tommy Wiseau. Tommy also wrote it. He also directed it. He also produced it. And it shows. I mean, this is coming from me. I'm a guy who's writing, acting, directing, producing, editing, and composing my own series right now. So I know what he's going through. But we'll get to that later. I'm jumping ahead. Tommy Wiseau is a enigma of a man who decided to break into the Hollywood system the only way he could because he wasn't getting an agent. He wanted to be an actor. It wasn't happening. So he decided he was going to make his own movie. And he wrote a screenplay called The Room, and he made it. And it ended up being the most famous so good it's bad movie ever made. And The Disaster Artist is the true story about the making of that movie. And it's not only that, but it's the story of the friendship between Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero, his best friend, who also ends up playing a big part in the movie. So again, this is just a little primer in case there's any of you out there who don't know what The Room is. If you Google The Room, go on YouTube and just type in The Room, you'll find clips from it. It is shockingly, hilariously bad. It's just one of those bad movies that needs to be seen to be believed. And a lot of that stems from Tommy Wiseau and sort of the strange way he looks at the world. This is a man who does not really see the world the way the rest of us do, and that sort of comes into play in his screenplay. It's hard to describe, but you can tell this script, if you just listen to the words and nothing else, this script was written by a person who does not see the world the way the rest of us do. And I think it can be a beautiful thing sometimes, and it really shines through. And in The Disaster Artist, particularly, they really make a great point of showing us Tommy's point of view, because it's very easy to sit down and watch The Room and laugh at Tommy Wiseau, but it's much more difficult to sit down and watch Disaster Artist and empathize with Tommy Wiseau. But you will empathize, because The Disaster Artist is one of the best movies of the year, and it absolutely made this man sympathetic. It made him likable. It made him strangely relatable. I mean, this is an odd dude. This is a guy that you wouldn't look at him and say, like, I relate to this person. It's not happening. I tried to dress up like him for this, and this is the closest approximation I could find. You can't even really dress up as the guy. Like, it's just, he's another world unto himself. And the movie wonderfully brings all of that forward and says, sure, you can laugh at these parts because this is funny. This is an odd duck we're dealing with. But remember, this is a human being too. So let's now that recap's out of the way, let's go over the story. Tommy Wiseau meets his friend Greg Sestero. They're in an acting class together. And Greg is very shy. He wants to be an actor, but it's not, he's closed off from the world. He's not he can't bring his emotions out on stage, and he's just, he's struggling. He's not reached the potential of his talent yet. Tommy is a person who acts as if he's got the most raw talent of anybody that the industry's ever seen, even though he doesn't. And he goes on stage and pours out everything. Greg even tells him, "You're fearless," and I admire that. And he is. Tommy comes across as a very fearless person when he's acting. But the friendship that blossoms between them is because there's this respect where Tommy's trying to teach Greg to open up, and Greg is trying to sort of, bring Tommy down to everybody's level and kind of integrate him in society more. And the two kind of butt heads in this wonderful, wonderful way. Their friendship is the stuff of legends, man. It's great. Now, this movie is based off of this book right here, The Disaster Artist. This book was written by Greg Sestero and another writer whose name escapes me, Tom Bissell. Thank you. This is essentially not a biography, but the story of meeting Tommy and making the room and all of that, as told by Greg Sestero. There's him on the back there. Oh, hi, Mark. And there's Tom Bissell, who helped him write it. And the book covers everything from, like I said, from when they first met to the premiere of The Room in 2003, I believe. And it sort of chronicles their friendship, and it chronicles the whole filmmaking process that they went through, and trying to keep this friendship intact during all of that. And it covers it in astonishing detail. I'm talking like stuff you didn't even want to hear is in this book. So I was curious. I read this about a year ago, and I was really curious how well they were going to adapt it into this movie. And I think that for the most part, it's a very good adaptation. There's some parts are like word for word. It's great. Well, granted, it came from real life, so I mean they probably want to keep it word for word. Stuff always gets lost in translation when you compare a book and a movie. If you liked the film, I really recommend you read that book, because there is just so much more Tommy goodness. There's so much more of how Greg feels. There's so much more on-set drama. So the movie The Room is about a man named Johnny, who is, in Tommy's words, a real all-American hero. And Johnny lives with his girlfriend Lisa, and their best friend Mark lives in the same building. I think it's never really clear. It's not like a Three's Company situation. Like, I think he lives like a floor above them or something weird. And Johnny is apparently this perfect guy with a good job, and he dotes on his girlfriend. But Lisa's bored of him, and she cheats on him with Mark. And that leads to a lot of infighting and a love triangle and messy business. And Johnny ends up going crazy at the end of the movie and killing himself. That's The Room. That's not what The Disaster Artist is. That's the movie that they're making in The Disaster Artist. So if you don't know what The Room is, that's what it was. And Tommy Wiseau plays Johnny, and Greg Sestero plays Mark. And the whole sort of crux of The Disaster Artist revolves around them making this film, because that's the only way they can get their names into this like goddamn competitive industry that is the Hollywood film machine. As an actor myself, like, those parts really hit home for me when the two of them are sort of, they're just struggling to find work. And Greg makes a comment. He says, I call my agent every single day, and all I hear day in and day out is no, no. And it's so effing depressing to hear that. Almost everybody can relate to that. And these poor guys are just like, well, we should make our own movie. And Tommy Wiseau, some gears start turning in his head, and he starts making this movie. But like I said, he's not quite on the same playing field as everybody else. He's from a different planet, this guy. And what ends up happening is you get this hilarious and heartwarming story of a man just trying to make his dreams come true. But he's doing so with all the resources of a very wealthy adult, but with all the mental resources of a very naive young man, almost a child. He's got the naivete of a child, Tommy Wiseau. And I think that is the most endearing part of his character, is that he believes so strongly that he has what it takes, and that he's going to make it in the world, and that he's going to bring happiness to the world through his films. And in a way he has. We've laughed and we've smiled along with The Room, and now The Disaster Artist comes along, and we've laughed and smiled to that too. And there are parts in this movie that are gonna get you a little bit choked up, and I think that's a good thing. because I can't stress enough, there is a man, there is a person behind the luscious black locks that is Tommy Wiseau. James Franco does a magnificent job playing Tommy Wiseau. He is amazing. When I first heard that he was going to play him, I was a little bit skeptical. Like I was, I wasn't like recast, sign my petition. Like I didn't care, but I was like, that's I wouldn't put those two links together. When I see Tommy Wiseau, I don't immediately think James Franco. So I was curious about how he was going to do it. When I saw the first trailer for The Disaster Artist, I knew. I'm like, this is it. He nailed it. And he's so committed to the role. He plays it like a human, which I love. He doesn't play it as somebody doing a goofy impression of Tommy Wiseau. I mean, anybody, like, I can sit here and do an impression of Tommy Wiseau right now. I can do like, what a story, Mark. But that's not the only thing James Franco does. He does the impression, but he's playing the human underneath too, which is so important. And I'm glad that he's the one who ended up getting this role, because I feel like it would have been so easy to just make it a caricature, but they went deeper than that. Dave Franco as Greg Sestero, again, phenomenal. Like Greg Sestero is he's not as larger than life as Tommy is. He's not really a character. He's just a dude. He's a normal dude. He's a good looking guy who wants to be an actor, and he's very humble and like he's a nice dude. He's a nice, affable fella. Everybody wants to be his friend. He's a cool guy, and Dave did that really well. I was so impressed with their choice of like hair and makeup in this movie was on point, because everybody's hair had to match how all these people in real life looked. All the characters who inhabit the Disaster Artist were real people who acted and or worked on The Room. And there are many scenes in The Room where Mark, for example, Greg Sestero's character, has different hairstyles, different beard styles. And in The Disaster Artist, Dave Franco was continuously on point with the way he looked. He always looked like how Mark and or Greg would look at any given time. God, it's really hard to talk about a movie when there's a movie going on inside. I'm saying like 18 different names for everybody. I feel like J.R.R. Tolkien. Everybody's got 12 nicknames. The girl who played Lisa, I actually don't know who she was, but she was excellent. She had that sweet charm, the enthusiasm, the professionalism. You got Seth Rogen as Sandy Schklair. He did a great job. He again, everybody brought the right amount of funny, but the right amount of humanity, which could have tipped the scales really badly if they had left that out. If they have just made this a straight up romp where they're like, let's make fun of Tommy, you could have ended up with something horrible on your hands. But they didn't do that. The recreation of key scenes from The Room. This is what we all wanted to see. This is why we buy tickets to watch The Disaster Artist. We want to see James Franco and Dave Franco and everybody else recreate the scenes from The Room. And they do it, man. They do it. I'm not going to go, stick around after the spoilers if you're okay with spoilers, and I'll let you know what they did, but they did it. But it's tricky here because this is a true story. So how do you say spoiler alert for a true story? I guess if you've never heard the story, if you don't know anything about The Room or what ends up happening to them, then yeah, this would be considered a spoiler. So at this point, if you don't want to know spoilers about this movie, stop here. Come back later. All right. So the making of this movie, the making of The Room, forms about, I'd say, a good half, maybe more than half of The Disaster Artist. And that's what we all want to see. We want to see them recreate The Room. And holy shit, do they ever recreate The Room, man. It is almost spot on. Some parts, you can tell it's a little bit, but for the most, it's like 98%. It is great. And they really bring to life a lot of the behind-the-scenes drama that went on during the making of it. The book will tell you a lot more, but there were parts about how Tommy would show up 4 hours late to set, even though he was director. He wasn't very professional. He was very rude to his cast and crew. humiliating them in front of the entire production team at some point. He didn't let anybody have water, but yet he didn't pay for air conditioning, so the studio was like 100 degrees and sweltering hot. He was not a good person to work for. He was actually a very tyrannical director. He wasn't doing it because he was an asshole. He was doing it because, again, it's the naivete of his character. He believes, he's looking back at all the Hollywood classics, and he says to Greg Sestero at some point, he says, Alfred Hitchcock, he treats his actors really mean, but he get good response and good action, and he frightened them. So he's doing these things not because he's just a giant prick. He's doing them because he believes in his heart of hearts that by pushing his crew and cast emotionally, he's going to get a better movie out of it, which isn't always necessarily the case. He really has to learn when to pick his battles, and that's something that Tommy just can't, that doesn't click for him. That's not the way his brain works. He sees the world very black and white, which is, like I said, it's an endearing trait, but at times it makes you want to punch him in the face, and this is one of those times when he's embarrassing the poor girl who plays the lead female in the room. He embarrasses her in front of the whole crew, and the crew does not take it well, and they, like, it almost comes to blows at certain points. And in the book, it's much worse. Like there's the scene in The Disaster Artist, and if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about, where they're filming the sex scene from the room, and that's when a lot of this unpleasantness bubbles up to the surface, and it's a very uncomfortable scene to watch. You're sitting there, you're like, oh God, this is hard to watch. The scene, as it was told in the book, was much worse. It really painted an even more grim picture. There were a lot of cameos in this movie that I was not expecting, which was great. I mean, the cast is already phenomenal. You've got James Franco, you've got his brother Dave. Why is his name? It's Dave Franco, right? Wow, that's bad of me. I'm sorry, dude. You were awesome in the movie. It's Dave Franco. Alison Brie, who I think is married to Dave Franco in real life, so it makes sense she's in there. Seth Rogen's in there. And then we got some great cameos from just people I was not expecting. You've got the crew from How Did This Get Made, one of my favorite podcasts. You got my boy Jason Mantzoukas, you got Paul Scheer, June Diane Raphael. They're all in there, which is very fitting because How Did This Get Made has done, I think, 2 episodes about The Room. That's how great The Room is as a so bad it's good movie. FYI, sidebar, if you are a podcast fan and or a fan of cheesy bad movies, check out How Did This Get Made. All right, commercial over. There were Casey Wilson. Casey Wilson has a cameo in this. I haven't seen her in a long ass time. I love that girl. There's a bunch of others just peppered in there, which is so great. There was a scene at the beginning of the movie that I wasn't expecting. It was a nice surprise, where it was just sort of like talking head testimonials from a random who's who of people working in Hollywood, which was nice too, because you hear all these people talking about The Room, and you don't, they're random people who have worked in the industry. Like you've got Kristen Bell, Kevin Smith, J.J. Abrams. That's just to name a few. There were a bunch of others too, but all these people sort of just sat down and gave their honest opinions, very briefly, mind you, about The Room and about the impact it's had on film culture and on bad film culture. And it's all coming from a place of deep respect. Nobody's sitting there being a jerk and like trash talking Tommy Wiseau. They're coming from a place of just awe, where like, how did this get made? You can tell that they have this wonderful appreciation for everything that The Room is and everything that it's done, and how much the fans love it too, because the fans, this movie has a fan base that is shockingly big. The Disaster Artist ends with the premiere of The Room, and we get the beautiful moment where Tommy Wiseau is sitting, I believe it's the poster of the movie, where he's sitting in the theater and Greg Sestero is next to him, and they have a packed cinema full of people for this premiere. Now Tommy, there's a scene in the book that didn't make its way into the movie, and I wish it had, where Tommy Wiseau is first writing the script for The Room, and he's explaining to Greg Sestero what he wants this movie to be like. And they had just come back from watching that Matt Damon movie, The Talented Mr. Ripley. And he wanted it to be something like that. He wanted a thriller slash drama that would really get under the skin of the characters and the audience. I'm paraphrasing here, but in the book, he makes mention of how when people watch The Room, he wants them to be so disturbed by what they see that they don't sleep for a week. He wants The Room to be that kind of movie. So when we get to this scene at the premiere, and everybody's seated in the theater, and this amazing movie plays on the screen, and everybody starts laughing hysterically and making fun of Tommy, we cut to a shot of James Franco as Tommy Wiseau, and he's crying. He's like, "Look, why are these people laughing at me?" And God, that was hard to see. Like, this is a man, a human being who's, he's not going about it very well, but regardless, he is bearing his soul on camera, and he's getting mocked for it. But the disaster art, I keep wanting to say the movie, but there's two movies in play here, so I really have to be specific. The disaster artist is very conscious of the fact that we need to, like, it's okay to laugh at these goofy things that are going on, but we need to respect what the man was trying to do. Now, like I said, it's tricky to talk about what is a spoiler and what is not a spoiler when you're dealing with something that's based on a true story. Like, for example, I don't know if it was last year, but when the movie Straight Outta Compton came out, I knew that was based on a true story. I mean, NWA are real people. I just didn't know what the story was. I didn't know what their tale was. So going into that, I was pleasantly surprised by what I watched. So if you don't know the tale of The Room, if you don't know the tale of Tommy Wiseau, then these things would be considered spoilers. But this, I think, is a spoiler through and through, what I'm about to say. It's the thing, like I mentioned earlier, what everybody wants to see. Everybody wants to see the recreation of key scenes from The Room. And I was expecting very little of this, to be honest. I was actually expecting the film to end before we saw parts of The Room. We saw the making of it as it was happening, but I expected the disaster artist to sort of cut to black as the lights dimmed on the night of the premiere, and I'm glad it didn't, because there's important stuff after that. We saw snippets of The Room as people are watching it in the theater, and that was great. Everybody, it was recreated beautifully. But then they did something absolutely great that I think was my favorite part of the whole movie, which was right at the very end. I wasn't expecting this at all. This is, like I said, as spoilery as the disaster artist can get. If you want to be surprised, stop now. It said the end, cut to black, and the lights in the theater came on. But there was more. They brought up for the next... It went on for a while. I'm going to say maybe 5 minutes. They had the screen split in half, side by side, with the actual footage of The Room, and then footage from the disaster artist of James Franco and Dave Franco and the others recreating The Room. And the side-by-side comparison, when you see it, the way that they shot for shot retold The Room, everything from the body movements to the facial expressions to obviously the delivery of lines, the wardrobe, everything was 98% note perfect. It was stunning how good of a job they did. We got to see the pet shop scene. The pet shop scene. I said pet shop because there's a dog in it. It's not a pet shop, dummy. The flower shop scene. There were moments during that where I was just like floored by how close it was. There was a shot of Dave Franco and Greg Sestero who were sitting down, and they're looking up at the girl who's playing Lisa. And they both moved their eyes and looked up at the same exact moment. And you wouldn't know unless you were watching it side by side like that. I don't want to give away all the surprises in that scene. There's so many of them, but you get them all. And of course, you will get plenty of the scene on the rooftop, the one everybody knows. Oh, hi, Mark. You will get plenty of that, I promise. 2 thumbs up, man. They did it. They did it. What you want this movie to do, they did it. The Disaster Artist is one of the best movies I've seen all year. Maybe actually one of the best true story movies I've seen, period. Because I find that when biopics happen, because of the way real life works, real life is just real life, I find that biopics are very anticlimactic because of that. You know, real life doesn't have climaxes and crazy endings because that's not how life works. That's how movies work. But The Disaster Artist had a climax. It wasn't anticlimactic. Like I said, I mentioned Straight Outta Compton before. I love Straight Outta Compton. I thought that was a great movie. It was just kind of anticlimactic. You know, it ended because that's where their story, and that's not anybody's fault. That's just how NWA's story played out. And then it's like, okay, and then NWA stopped. And they're not a band anymore. But The Disaster Artist was lucky enough to have a story where you could end it in a perfect sweet spot. There's like a little G spot in Tommy Wiseau's life that was the perfect place to end this movie, and that's where they did. Whether or not you know about The Room, you have to see this movie. If you're an actor or if you're somebody who makes film for a living, if you are in this industry and you love it, if your toes are dipped in filmmaking in any way, watch The Disaster Artist. If you love movies that are so bad they're great, watch The Disaster Artist. Literally the only reason that you should not watch this movie is if you just don't like movies, period. Then yeah, do something else with your time. Read a book or something. Plant a daffodil. But that has been Thumb Together. Thank you so much for talking about Disaster Artist with me. And I will see you next time when we talk about more real Hollywood movies. What a story. Thanks, guys. Be sure to like and subscribe to me because that's how YouTube works. And I love it when you do that. It warms my heart. It gives me all the fuzzies. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Thumb Together.